All right, today is August 7th, 2025, and my guest is Adam Thierer again. Adam has been on the podcast before. He's the author of Permissionless Innovation and Evasive Entrepreneurship and a policy analyst based in DC. His work has a very big influence and is very thematic with the podcast here. In the past, we talked about AI policy and permissionless innovation primarily, which had, and a lot of things have changed in the last 2 years, some for the better, some for the worse. And some of these trends, and many of them are actually very relevant for regular listeners on this podcast. So really excited to have Adam back on the show. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, Adam. So tell us what is going on in DC right now, right? So AI policy is a hot topic. It has been for the last couple of years. Things changed a lot with the administration. Where are we at right now?
Yeah, well, when we last chatted, we were talking about how we were witnessing what I refer to as the beginnings of a war on computation. There were so many different types of new ideas and regulations that were being floated by policymakers, both in the United States and abroad in many different countries, that it was getting very, very hard to keep track of them. But they all shared a lot in common, starting with the fact that there was an effort to really regulate computing and computation at its very core. And so we remember just 2 years ago, 2 years and a couple of months ago, there were proposals to pause AI globally with many, many signatories signing on to such a pledge. There were ideas about creating domestic and international new regulatory bodies that would be very AI specific and regulate all things algorithmic. There were new licensing schemes being proposed and liability schemes being pitched. And there were all sorts of other types of corresponding comprehensive cross-cutting regulations. And at that point in time, that war on computation, it looked very grim. It looked like it was a multifaceted, multi-jurisdictional attack on technological freedom. And I'm happy to say that 2 years on from that, we've turned a corner. A lot of people have realized that we got out to a bad start and we were saying some truly crazy things. And a lot of policymakers have come to realize that, well, these fears were overblown and it was based on a sort of techno panic about robotics and AI driven by movies and science fiction plots more than reality. I think policymakers also recognize that this has geopolitical stakes, that there is an ongoing race about who's going to lead in AI and advanced computation globally. And the threat of China racing ahead while we did stupid things was just intolerable to many policymakers. They realize, we have to be in this proverbial race, or as some people even call it, an AI Cold War. And then I think the final thing that changed is that a lot of policymakers and a lot of others realized that, like, to regulate AI in the ways that they were talking about would have compromised the many significant benefits of algorithmic and machine learning technologies, and that we wouldn't want to see those costs come about if they meant less of a chance to save lives, improve lives, and public welfare in other ways. And so, really, in sum, I think basically what happened is that the adults entered the conversation. There were a lot of crazy people that were running the conversation about AI policy in those days. And, we called them doomers and other things, but, they were dominating the discussion. You remember the famous uh, quote in Time magazine from Yukowski saying, we should consider bombing the data centers, you know, bombing data centers to stop the advance of technology is just about as extreme as you can possibly go as a policy recommendation. And it was in Time magazine in the United States. Now people are like, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. Who would ever say something like that? Well, there was a time not that long ago when people were saying it. So I'm happy to say that in many important ways, we've seen a vibe shift in the AI policy world. One where people are embracing benefits or at least understanding trade-offs. And that's a positive development, if nothing else. Doesn't mean the world's perfect. It just means we've turned an important corner, I think.
Great. And I remember very well from our last conversation, the surprising thing was that the policymakers in DC, who've often been sitting there for decades, for them, they didn't really buy the doom argument. For them, it was really a chance hey, we can finally now do what we were missing out on in the 90s, which is regulating the internet and computing itself. Right. So maybe you can remind our listeners of the context and especially the idea of an industry born free or an industry born in captivity and how the internet came to be what it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that question, Nicholas, because it's really important that we can remember where we came from before we can understand where we're going in this area. And where we came from on the internet and digital technology is in a pretty good place. We started off in the internet age with a chance to make a fresh break from the way governments had traditionally regulated information and communications technologies and sectors, which was very heavy-handed command and control, top-down regulation, in some cases, licensing and censorship, or even complete government nationalization of media and technology or telecommunication systems. We spent a full century under that miserable regulatory model, and it failed consumers, it failed the public and public safety and everything else. It was a dismal failure. And finally, in some countries, including in the United States in the 1990s, there was a move to make a break with the past and say, let's try something different. And at that moment, the internet was born and the digital age dawned, and we had that chance to make that fresh break. And so, effectively, in the United States and some other countries, we put the equivalent of a legal firewall between the old media and communications world and policies and the new emerging digital technology space. And instead of treating, the new digital world with a sort of precautionary principle mindset and set of licensing schemes and government regulation, we said, let's give this a fresh chance. Let's see what happens if freedom is our default. And so we allowed for so-called permissionless innovation to take root in the internet space and allowed people to go out and pursue their dreams and be entrepreneurial in a mostly free market oriented way. And the results were amazing. I mean, we saw the biggest explosion in information and information platforms and services in human history. Until that point in time, the primary concern of technology policy in the world of information and communication systems was a concern about scarcity. How are we going to alleviate scarcity in media, people not having enough informational inputs or access to communications, outlets? Well, we solved that. We solved it so effectively that the common complaint we have today is information overload. People are all running around saying, "Oh, there's too much information. There's disinformation. There's all these different players that are like have all this power." Well, the reality is I'm here to say that a world of information overload is a lot better world to live in than one of information poverty. And so we made an important historical turn in policy that affected how society worked. But here's the thing. A lot of people didn't like it. First of all, a lot of industries that were protected by law didn't like it. Also, there were some people in certain sort of social institutions that didn't like the results of freedom, including certain, churches and religious groups, things like that. They wanted it censored. And then, of course, there were policymakers. They just wanted to control it. They didn't like the fact that they were, letting loose of this new technology and people could do what they want. They wanted to have a say on everything. And so along comes AI after 25 years of the internet and social media and digital technologies. And a lot of policymakers started saying, unfortunately, well, we can't allow to happen with AI what we allowed to happen with the internet and social media. And that was really strange because what they were saying was like, okay, we should have done it differently back then. We should have just gone ahead and licensed the internet like it was a broadcast radio station, or we should have regulated, everything online as if we were regulating, a telecommunications or cable system. That would have been a huge mistake, and it would have perpetuated the problems of the past. But some people really do believe that today. And now they look at AI and said, oh, okay, we're going to assert some control. We're going to try to regulate this thing preemptively using a precautionary principle mindset. And that's where we're at 2 years ago, because a lot of them didn't like the taste of freedom. They didn't like the idea that they didn't have control. So they wanted to exert it. And early on they did. But again, I think now there's a recognition that there are huge trade-offs associated with regulating that way. The easiest way to know is just to look at countries that have fallen into that trap, like many countries in the European Union. The European Union has foolishly, obviously, taken a precautionary principle approach to digital technology. And for the last 25 years, they've squandered their opportunity to be a global leader to the point where it's hard to name any leading digital technology companies based in Europe today. Even though at the beginning of the digital revolution, the European Union and the United States were on very even footing with regards to companies, talent, investment. And then the Europeans started regulating everything, especially data flows. And so that meant the end of the digital revolution for the European continent. And today, 18 of the 25 largest digital technology companies in the world are US headquartered. Only two are European. And of the 8 companies in the world that are trillion-dollar companies, 7 of them are American and none of them are European. I could go on down the list with all these statistics about how Europe essentially became, as some scholars call it, the biggest loser in the digital world or in the internet policy wars. But that's their own fault. They chose badly when they thought about the policy paradigm that would govern digital technology. And now they're doing it all over again with artificial intelligence. So here we are again with a choice to be made for countries and continents. Do we choose permissionless innovation and freedom for a new technology, or do we choose the precautionary principle and box everybody into a regulatory cage? And I think we've turned a little bit of a corner, at least in the United States on this front. If nothing else, I think the China threat has really woken up a lot of policymakers to the fact that they can't regulate like Europe, because they now see Europe struggling to not only deal with to compete in the digital world, but they struggle in their energy sector, in their national security. They're beholden to Russia for energy, and they're, worried about what would happen if, Russia invaded. Well, if you hollow out your technology sector, it has broad ramifications for geopolitical security. You're going to be on very weak footing. So these are the factors that have changed the policy debate in the United States around artificial intelligence and advanced computation in the last 2 years.
One thing that may be surprising or noteworthy is that the changes you're describing, the permissionless innovation and the enabling legal framework for it, came under the Clinton administration by Democrats, and also a huge deregulatory push before was not by Ronald Reagan, but was by Jimmy Carter, like in the airline industries and food and beverages and beer and things like that. So it was often like under a Democrat administration, while we actually often at least associate Republican administration, at least in rhetoric, with these kinds of deregulatory pushes. Now we have things like the pro-growth abundance agenda through Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein. And some of the rhetoric kind of persists in some parts of the current administration. Kind of what do these cleavages say kind of about the coalition building that's going on in Washington, D.C. from then until now?
That's another great question. And this is something I write about in a new study that I wrote for the Civitas Institute, where I talk about how the history that we have forgotten in terms of how there was a time when Democrats and progressives were the ones that embraced freedom and deregulation in a variety of markets, because they understood that if you try to overregulate certain sectors, you ultimately only benefit the largest companies and players who want protected markets. And it took Democrats to deregulate airlines and surface transportation and to begin some energy deregulation in the late 70s, early 80s to unlock a lot of the benefits that we saw flow throughout the following 40 years. And then when we got around to the internet age, it was the Clinton-Gore administration that really led with its so-called framework for global electronic commerce, which basically proposed a very market-oriented, open, freewheeling type of policy environment for the internet and digital commerce and electronic systems. And that was hugely beneficial, because what it did is it sent a clear signal to markets that is sort of a green light to be entrepreneurial, to go forward, to think differently and dream big, without having to get a permission slip from some bureaucrat to go out and innovate. Again, that was the Clinton-Gore administration vision. And there were many Republicans in Congress that went along with it, but it was led by Democrats. Now, that's an interesting question from a political science perspective. Why is it that in certain periods of history, it's been the Democrats that have essentially unleashed abundance, that have been willing to open up the policy world and rethink old broken laws? Well, I think it has something to do with it, the fact that in the past, the Republican Party was simply way too close to certain large corporate interests, and that they basically were, beholden to those interests when people were proposing deregulation, because the interests would say, well, that's not good for markets. But what they were really saying is it wasn't good for them. They didn't want deregulation, the airlines in the 1970s, because they knew they had protected cartelistic markets. And the same goes for certain telecommunications or cable companies in the 90s. They're like, wait a minute. So, it took thinking outside the box and recognizing that regulation can be, even if it says it's supposed to be pro-consumer, it can be viciously anti-consumer and anti, choice. And so I think that this was an important lesson that was forgotten. It seems to be forgotten every generation, that all of a sudden, like, we take for granted all the gains that we got from trade and investment and new technological innovation. And we go back to regulating really stupidly. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of Democrats got stuck back in that bucket again and started doing some really dumb things with regards to technology regulation during the Biden years. And it really hurt them. They basically lost a lot of their friends in the technology industry who went and supported, Donald Trump when he was running for president again. It also, like, cost them the chance to, like, find a new base of support, beyond just the traditional base. So I think it was a serious miscalculation, but unfortunately, a lot of Democrats were going that direction. But now, just recently, with the launch of the new Abundance book by Klein and Thompson, and a growing movement on the center left to rethink their priorities, we are again starting to see this sort of reformulation of democratic thinking and policy around emerging technologies or even existing technologies like the energy sector. And that's really, really great. In my Civitas Institute study, I talk about this and say, like, this, we should embrace the idea that Democrats want to be about abundance, even if sometimes the details are murky, we're not clear what they mean by it. And even if there's like a break in that tradition or in that coalition where it's not clear where everybody stands, the very fact that they're embracing the term abundance is a positive thing. And we should applaud them for it and figure out how we can work together at the margin to, like, effectuate positive change for liberty.
Yeah. What this suggests to me, or just one thought that came to my mind, is that kind of regardless of the ideological overtones, an important factor is who the business interests that are involved, right? So under the Biden administration and previous Democrat administration, or generally, Democrats have gotten just much more influential in corporate America, right? Sort of policies regarding like board seats and stakeholder governance and all of that. And also most employees of large corporations are now Democrats, and sort of the picture of the company man or like has a bit shifted, right? So Democrats are much more sort of they have much more of these. Is that an apt observation, you think?
I think it's probably, it is a problem of sorts. I mean, obviously a lot of Washington elites, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, have gotten too close to various special interests. And this is part of the problem of politics coming into play in, the world of markets, is that a cozy relationship develops between them. The great economist Alfred Kahn, who was the most forward-thinking expert on regulation in the 1960s and 70s, wrote a very famous 2-volume treatise called The Economics of Regulation. And it was essentially the Bible of, like, how regulation works, or rather doesn't work, in the United States. Alfred Kahn was a self-described liberal Democrat, but he studied this issue closely. And he said the fundamental problem with modern economic regulation is that you develop this sort of symbiotic relationship between the regulator and the regulatee, and they have to essentially lean on each other. And they seem like they're at odds or at tension or fighting, but really they're not. They're relying on each other. And so when anything threatens the status quo or that sort of relationship that they have, they actually both push back in slightly different ways against change. And of course, there are so many examples of this throughout history. But the most important one that we already discussed was airlines. Who was it that was brought in by the Carter administration to deregulate the airlines? It was Alfred Kahn. They leaned on him because they know he wouldn't play this game. And if you go back and read his speeches to industry when he's speaking to, like, airline conferences and stuff, he's like, I'm telling you folks, I'm not going to protect you anymore. You're going to be out there competing, and you need to stop playing political games and start getting in the marketplace and, doing serious investment in competition. They didn't like the sound of that. But it took a man like Alfred Kahn to basically break that logjam. And he did it again, working with other Democrats, the Carter administration and Senator Ted Kennedy in the U.S. Senate and others, to basically shake things up. I think a lot of Democrats today don't see the world the same way. They have a far more adversarial relationship with markets and freedom, just generally speaking. And, they're just fundamentally so suspicious of capitalism that they struggle with these things about how to reformulate their thinking. I'm glad the abundance movement is changing it, because at some point all you need to do is look at real world results and say something's not working. We have all of these regulatory policies to like lower housing costs or tuition or increase, market choices, and they don't work when we try to mandate it because they don't embrace freedom. And if you really want abundance, you have to begin with a principle of understanding that it begins with freedom and not control. And hopefully that lesson is learned by the abundance movement, and they're willing to loosen up a little bit and get more, influence in democratic circles in the future administrations, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the Biden years that we saw in other technology issues.
Yeah. So back to present times. So some of the crazy stuff has changed now, and we have the abundance movement now. But at the same time, you're saying that there is new attacks on technological change and the freedom to innovate from more quarters than ever before.
Mhm.
So you're saying in the first 5 months of 2025, there have been over 1,000 AI-related bills introduced across the United States, right? Which is mostly coming in states. So what's happening there?
Yeah, this is an astonishing development. In the first 5 months of 2025, there were over 1,000 AI-related bills introduced across the United States. As of right now, there's about 1,100 bills. And these bills vary in character. They try to regulate AI and machine learning and data systems in different ways. But the bottom line is most of them are very fear-driven, fears about AI and computational systems or big data systems. And so they try to use a precautionary principle type of approach to control them. So unfortunately, these things are not just Democratic led. There are Republicans that support some of these bills too, but they're mostly Democratic led. And a lot of it comes down to a new concern about potential for algorithmic discrimination or bias, or the idea of, AI fairness or AI, non-discrimination. Well, who could be against that? I'm not against that. I don't want AI systems to discriminate. I don't want them to be biased. But what does it mean? And how do you want to regulate bias in algorithmic systems? There's a lot to unpack there. And the bottom line is that we already have many, many laws in the United States and in most countries that already address concerns about bias, discrimination, or civil rights, or fairness, or unfair and deceptive practices. There's no shortage of those laws. But what some Democrats unfortunately believe is they want to take a more European style approach to regulating these things preemptively to make sure that no bad outcomes can ever happen. The so-called better to be safe than sorry mentality, which again is just the precautionary principle. This is what got Europe in so much trouble. And so a lot of these state bills, including one very important one that passed in the state of Colorado last May, basically would try to find a way to preemptively legislate around the idea of algorithmic fairness or non-discrimination, and to require these systems, algorithmic systems, to be probed and tested to make sure that there's no theoretical bias. It would have new, bodies or bureaucracies that would be in sort of charge of like figuring out standards for what we mean by AI discrimination, and then have things like algorithmic audits or impact assessments, basically just a lot of paperwork, a lot of red tape, a lot of compliance. And it basically is the old environmental regulation model or labor market regulation model brought to the world of emerging high technology. And so that's a very, very, very bad model to be adopting, because we know now from history the compliance costs associated with that are significant, and it's particularly burdensome to small and medium-sized enterprises that we want to help create to counter the power of large technology companies. And so I'm sorry to say that these bills are still out there. Luckily, they have not as many have passed as I feared would have passed a year ago, but there still are some. And then there are a lot of other bills that would regulate AI in very different ways, like very specific types of things. Like, are you using AI in hiring, like employment decisions? That there's bills to regulate that. Are you using AI in healthcare to improve health outcomes? Bills to regulate that. Are you using AI in transportation for things like driverless cars? Bills to regulate that. I could go on down this list. So there's all these AI and fill in the blank sectors or technologies where there's bills that specifically target those more potentially sensitive or popular uses of AI. And so we have a multifaceted, multi-layered, multi-jurisdictional kind of regulatory accumulation happening. The best news is that the majority of these bills are still struggling to get finished. And I'm happy about that. A lot of other people are frustrated about it. But a lot of people in our Congress in the United States grew concerned enough about the fact that most of these are coming out of the states that they proposed a moratorium on state regulation, state and local regulation of AI until the federal government could get a framework together to sort of harmonize the rules, whatever the rules are going to be, for the national AI marketplace in the United States. That effort failed to have that moratorium effort failed, but there's currently, as we speak today, in the summer of 2025, there is an effort underway in the United States Congress to try to find a way to have a AI legislative framework that can address this so-called patchwork of state and local policies that are developing. Because of course, this is something that's very unique to the United States relative to some other countries that don't have as much of a federalist system. Mostly they rely on federal rules. But the United States, most of the activity on technology regulation today is being driven by our state and local governments, and specifically a handful of really big states like the state of California, the state of New York, the state of Illinois, or the state of Colorado. In fact, those four states alone, they have introduced 250 of the AI bills, the 1,000 AI bills that I mentioned. So fully 1/4 of all the AI proposed regulations are coming from just four states. And those four states I mentioned, California, Illinois, Colorado, and New York, tend to be very heavily regulatory states. So that creates a very confusing situation in the United States today. And everybody is right now wondering, what the heck are we going to do about that?
Yeah. I'd love to dig a bit deeper into that kind of state federal dynamic. The background is that I have some firsthand experience with that recently, right? So I worked with the state of Montana to introduce a new right to try bill. And I'm now talking to several other states about it as well, which I'm confidently saying in my case is like a very pro growth, pro abundance kind of initiative.
Mhm.
So kind of observing the kind of cleavages there was very interesting, right? Sort of the Republican side, as was a red state, was very interested in the business friendliness of it and sort of the medical. But the medical freedom idea was also widely shared in Montana. Montana has sort of across the board a more libertarian ethos. The coalitions against it on the right were kind of a strong sort of anti-progress, anti-science, right? Like, and on the left, it was sort of a, hey, this only benefits the rich kind of thing, right? And so I'm curious, what is the dynamic with states, especially with those regulatory states? I can imagine it's things like these are people, and from what it sounds, it's more blue, it's more Democrat driven, that want to drive the regulatory agenda in DC by having on the state side first, which I can understand because I'm also trying to do that with this bill, right? But what can we say about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's break it into two parts. First of all, there are some states like Montana that definitely have a more pro freedom kind of vision and policy agenda. And I wish every state was Montana. They've done some really wonderful things, not only like right to try, but right to compute. They passed a bill called the Right to Compute Act that basically would try to protect the public's ability to use AI systems. That's a really interesting bill that could counter all the bad bills that are happening in the states. But really only Montana and a couple of other states have taken that sort of pro-freedom, more deregulatory, free market approach to AI. Most of them are looking to regulate in various other ways. Utah is another state that has done some interesting things in this regard. There's a couple of others. Some other states are talking about regulatory sandboxes. The idea of like the law would allow for more freedom within certain boxes, like If you want to do something with drones or driverless cars in certain corners of our state, you are allowed to do that for the next year or two. But that's like a special permissions, like selective freedom model, right? And while I support regulatory sandboxes to just allow for policy experimentation where currently there is none, as you know, with the case with like medical innovation, it's not enough. It's not enough to give people just a little bit of that freedom. We want to give them a lot more. And so we need to work harder to broaden that out. But I'm happy that at least Montana and Utah and Arizona and a couple of other states are taking the lead. But the problem is they will be countered by the other big bad liberal states like California, Colorado, Illinois, and New York. They're going to crush them with all these other regulations that ultimately will cancel out all those freedoms. Because if those big blue liberal states do that, the smaller pro-freedom states, their voice isn't going to be heard as much. Now, let me address the second point that you made. You alluded to something really interesting in your question, that when you were running the sort of right to try, the sort of, pro-freedom approach with regards to health, you actually experienced maybe a little bit of pushback or concern from certain other conservative voices that are out there, or maybe like, family groups or religious groups. This is interesting. There is a growing division within the world of conservatism about the relative importance or value of progress. And that's because there are some conservatives, they've always been around, but there's a lot more of them today, who look at new emerging technologies with a great deal of skepticism. They feel that they interfere with certain types of cultural or family or church values. They worry that new modern technologies might undermine the family, or they might alter our humanity. And so some conservatives are now starting to essentially join the other side in opposing progress. And they've done it in the past on certain health-related technologies, and those debates have never gone away. There's been an ongoing debate for many decades about in vitro fertilization. And the IVF policies that are still being debated today are sometimes hotly contested by certain religious conservatives. Well, now enter into the world of this debate. Enters AI, and AI and advanced computational technologies are just going to become even more disruptive, and they will serve as technologies of freedom. They will allow humans to go out and experiment with new capabilities, even when the law sometimes disallows it. We're going to see this. I wrote an entire book about this called Evasive Entrepreneurs and the Future of Governance. And I talked about how in many, many sectors, and especially in health, you're going to see people take advantage of these technological capabilities or the expansion of medical information and knowledge to try to figure out ways to have their own cures or their own therapies or whatever else. And some of that's going to be legitimately dangerous. We should admit that there's a real risk associated with the public just playing with new medical technologies or trying to self-diagnose, right? We want medical experts and authorities to be out there, but we also want people to have the freedom to go out and try to find ways to find therapies and assistance for chronic conditions or various medical ailments. AI is going to open that field wide up. And that makes a lot of conservatives very uncomfortable. And so there's a growing tension now in the old conservative, free market world between those of us who embrace the future and progress and new emerging technologies and those who worry about the disruptive effect on those things on culture or society or their own type of value stream or system. So stay tuned on that. I think this is where the old left and the old right could join forces in trying to stop progress. There's such a thing called horseshoe theory in the world of policy now that like the far left and the far right sometimes meet. And I see it a lot in the debate about AI. The effort to try to kill the AI moratorium that was pending in Congress was led not just by Democrats, but by certain conservative Republicans who wanted to see AI and social media regulated more heavily on the grounds that it undermined various values, family values, cultural values, whatever else. And so this is a new tension, a new fault line that is very much present in the field of AI policy.
Yeah, and to hone in on the kind of public choice point, right? So I wonder if the theory makes sense that when there's like a new emerging technology, a lot of public attention, then people want to obviously be the ones driving the agenda, right? And especially sort of the blue states, legislators with political ambitions, but actually want to go to DC, using their state as a model to then say, okay, this is how we regulate this new technology, kind of this new technocratic approach. Um, and then vice versa. And I'm asking this selfishly from my efforts, right? Because I'm not an AI, I'm in healthcare. In healthcare, there is basically almost total top-down control, right?
Mhm.
The FDA basically has jurisdiction over everything,
Right.
right? So I wonder, me sort of taking the approach, working a bit more with like pro-growth red states, and then taking it to DC, that I will face less resistance because it's not an emerging technology area and it's kind of is already top down regulated, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, it's a legitimate concern. I mean, anytime you have some sort of a preemption of state governments or local governments, and you ask the federal government to oversee the interstate marketplace, the danger exists that the federal government does really stupid things, like they've done with the FDA. And an even better example is the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, which has essentially shut down any sort of aviation competition and innovation for many, many decades. And so that's a real legitimate problem. And I have written about this tension in the past. In fact, the first of my 10 books was on federalism and interstate commerce in the technological arena. And it was essentially my open struggle with like, how do you draw these lines? Because we want to make sure we have the free flow of interstate commerce and sort of a national marketplace where consumers can choose from lots of different options and a very vibrant, innovative market. But we also don't want to foreclose the idea of like state or local governments potentially doing some more innovative things or people completely breaking out of the system and going their own way in a truly highly decentralized fashion. I'm in favor of that. But if you're going to be part of a national union, a national system where you care about interstate commerce, and we're talking about certain types of commerce that are clearly interstate in character, there's a legitimate question about like in that marketplace system, like how much of a role should states have that's of extraterritorial effect or impact? A lot of the things you're proposing, Nicholas, and that you're trying to do are so highly decentralized that like you're in your own little, literally your own little world, like doing these kind of things truly in experimental, like decentralized fashion. I think that's great. But you still are going to struggle with the question of how to then interface with the rest of the world and, how to trade and have, cross-border deals. In the United States, we have this massive internal free market. The United States Constitution was effectively the world's first free trade pact. And we decided to take away some of those limits on what you could do in order for commerce to flow across borders. So to the extent the states want to be part of the union and play ball and engage, they have to understand there's some limits to how far their rules can go before they spill over. But at the same time, the federal government needs to be kept in check somehow. We need some limits on what the federal government does. And so I like things like right to try and right to compute and other types of things to break out of that mold and say, let's try something different at the state level. But the real answer is we've got to clean up the mess at the federal level if we want to move forward. We have to make sure that where we know there's going to be some sort of a national policy agenda, that it be a pro-freedom agenda. And sometimes it isn't. With the FDA and the FAA and the EPA, it hasn't been in too many cases. So we need to change that. We need to work on that. But it's impossible for me to believe that we can eliminate any national role over what are national markets. And that tension is palpable and always with us as free market people. I love liberty, but you know what? States can be full of grassroots tyranny just as much as the federal government can. And I fight for freedom at every level, but I also understand that we live in a modern world with modern markets where it's not easy to define what is even a local, activity. For example, every time we use an algorithm here in our own states or our own cities, that algorithm is not stopping at the border before it goes to the next border and to the next one and the next one and asking for permission. It flows everywhere. That digital bit, that algorithm, it just flows as it should. That's the good thing. But that's partially because it's guaranteed by the fact that we created a free market at the national level. In 1998, I helped work on a bill called the Internet Tax Freedom Act that prohibited state and local governments from imposing multiple and discriminatory taxes on internet access. That law was eventually made permanent and is still enforced today. I mean, Should we have every state government locality essentially having a multiplicity of discriminatory taxes on every type of internet access such that right now in our communication, we would be charged by the second every time we say a word? I hope not. That wouldn't be pro-freedom. So it's a struggle. Drawing lines is hard, but I fight for freedom at all these levels. But sometimes understand that there's going to be hard choices at the margin, and sometimes we're going to make mistakes. And you've named a couple.
Yeah, there's no solutions, only trade-offs, right? And there's this
That's right.
delicate dance between centralization and decentralization, right? So,
Right.
the European Union, great. We have this integrated trade union and like open borders between the states and labor and things like that. But then it's abused for these other things, right? And that power it's very hard to limit that kind of power once it's implemented. And as you know, the interstate commerce part that's basically the FDA and FAA are basically the abuses of that we see, right? But let's shift gears. So
That's right.
back to the present moment in AI. Sir, yeah, you want to say something about that? Sorry, did you want to answer something about that?
Oh, no, I couldn't hear you. Unfortunately, I cut out there. What was your question?
Okay. No worries. I haven't asked the question yet. But I wanted to go back to the present moment and AI, right? So what are the important things now to know, especially for people in my audience who are entrepreneurs in AI, potentially those who are close to policy in AI and may have a voice there? What are the most important things to pay attention to right now? And if you have an AI startup or company that might be affected, what are the things you need to know?
Well, a lot depends on the sector or technology that we're talking about. AI is the most general purpose technology of all time. There are a lot of general purpose technologies, but AI touches everything, every segment of our economy, and every single sector is going to have its own unique AI play or application. And so, unfortunately, it's not easy to answer until we talk about the specific sectors, because we've talked about a few of them here today, like AI in health and AI in transportation. And those things are regulated radically differently than, say, AI in financial services or AI in energy, right? And some sectors are blessed to not be regulated all that much at all. If you are in the field of like virtual reality, or 3D printing, those are fields that are very much, as I call them, born free of excessive regulation and agency control. There's a lot of room to be very innovative there. But in some of these other sectors I named, you're born into captivity. So a driverless car is both a computer on wheels, but it's also an automobile. And we don't have a computer commission in the United States, but we have a lot of automobile regulation. And those two worlds have collided. And right now, the old world of analog era automobile regulation is still winning. It still dominates. And that's really unfortunate because driverless cars could be almost everywhere in the United States. But unfortunately, the states are holding them back and regulating them aggressively. So for people that you work with or your listeners, everything depends on where you sit in this world. And if you're lucky enough to be in a born free sector, you're going to have a lot easier time of it. Now, if you are in a born in captivity sector where you already have a lot of existing regulations, there's a number of different strategies you can rely upon. One is the unfortunate one of having to get into the political game and essentially lobby and try to find a way to petition for more freedom at the federal, state, local, and maybe even international level. That's really hard. It's really expensive. A lot of small entrepreneurs don't have the resources to be engaged politically. So that's really hard. In other cases, they can go the opposite extreme and they can engage in technological disruption or again, evasive entrepreneurialism, where they push back against the law. We forget about it now, but like 15 years ago, we didn't have any serious competition to taxi cab services or limousine services in most countries. And they were licensed and they were heavily protected cartels. And then Uber and Lyft came along and they changed everything almost overnight. That was an incredible story of technological disruption working marvelously. But let's remember that when Uber and Lyft entered those markets, they essentially didn't play by the rules. They said the rules stink. They're terrible. They're anti consumer, they're anti competition, they're anti freedom. And so we're going to essentially do an end run around those regulations. And we talked about this on the previous podcast when we were together. And I mentioned that like there's an ethical question about like should small and medium sized entrepreneurs should they engage in that what I call technological civil disobedience? And in some cases, they don't have any choice. If you want to get anything done, like Uber and Lyft found out, if you go and try to fight the system, you lose. For 100 years, people tried to fight that system of taxi cab and limousine monopolies, and they always lost. And even the governments around the world agreed it was an anti-consumer fiasco. But nothing changed until technological disruption happened. And somebody had the courage to try to work outside the system. So in the world of AI and machine learning, there's going to be even more opportunities like this. We've already talked about some that you're involved in. And I mean, I'm very excited what can happen in the field of medicine, and the advance of medical experimentation and medical knowledge is going to be incredibly beneficial. It's already the case today that people are armed with all sorts of information on their smartphones. And when you walk into a doctor's office now, or you talk to a regulator or an insurer or anybody, you are armed with more information than ever before because of this digital unregulated device. That's a wonderful thing, right? So you can imagine that happening on multiple levels with AI systems as they expand our knowledge set. If I can sit down with a large language model and pump in all this information about myself and about the world and everything that I care about, and then say, help me find a way around this system, around, to launch a new product or do something different, it's going to be very helpful. And that capability is only going to expand in coming years. So I'm personally very excited about that. But as you can imagine, defenders of the status quo, whether in government or industry, they're not so excited about it. And this is one of the grand fights of our time. Will AI become a technology of freedom, or will it be turned by those status quo defenders into a technology of repression, right? That risk exists, that if they get control of AI systems and they use them against our will and against the public, they can quash freedom with these technologies. My old colleague, Tyler Cowan at the George Mason University, when we used to be there at the Mercatus Center together, he had a very interesting unpublished manuscript from about 20 years ago, where he says, how is it that the power of the state grew so significantly during the 20th century? And his answer was it came down to a key set of network technologies, such as railroads, electricity, broadcast communication systems, and financial systems, that as they grew bigger, actually enabled the state to exert more control over society. And that's a really hard thesis for free market, liberty-loving people to deal with, because we want those technologies in big markets. But it's equally true that if governments can get their claws into them, then we're going to lose, and lose badly. And this is why AI as a technology of freedom is so essential. We've got to fight for it. We've got to make sure that we push back against the state and against all the efforts by those in the defenders of the status quo to try to box it in, control it, and use it for their own will. That's the fight we're at today.
Yeah. And also to add to your point, like on evasive entrepreneurship and so having to do lobbying yourself, this is so much easier now with AI, right? So the amount of additional like knowledge leverage you have per hour through AI is like 10 or 100 times. Like the amount of specialized attorneys you needed to understand all these interdependencies between local, state, and federal law. Now with AI, this makes it so much easier and cheaper, right? I can only imagine how much time like the Uber and Lyft teams must have spent on these kinds of decisions, on that kind of knowledge, right? Whereas now, this is just so much, like you still have to do a lot of thinking yourself. The AI is not going to write your bill and things like that. You have to go through line by line. But once you have, and it won't have novel ideas, right? Because we'll look at what's like already out there. But any sort of new idea that you have, you can test it. Like, does this sort of legal change or text run up against something that I'm not aware of, right? Or give me the whole text on like insurance regulation in the state, and how would we be able to like exempt this from it? So it's really the best time, like how AI is increasing the leverage for entrepreneurs, also on the like building technology side and coding side, there's really so much reason for optimism now with this technology, and also so much opportunity now for what you're describing and for increasing the space for permissionless innovation. And by really, one of the key steps for that is like changing and effectuating the laws. And it can be really fun, right? So I really enjoyed that process in Montana so far, and the continuation of
Mhm.
it, just because this uniquely possible now. I wouldn't enjoy this if I would have to spend like millions on these specialized attorneys, right?
Right, right. Yeah, it's very true. And let's be clear that what makes this even more exciting is that AI is part of a set of concurrent technological revolutions that are happening. There's a revolution happening in crypto. There's a revolution happening in biotech, revolution happening in robotics and data science. It's part of these concurrent revolutions. They all play together. It's what some scholars call combinatorial innovation, where all of these technologies are being combined and their powers are reinforcing and building on each other to make each of them more powerful and more influential. And when consumers or when the public is armed with that knowledge, they can do some really awesome things with it, especially for the field of health. And the fact that I'm going to be able to feed like all of my health data and information into personalized algorithmic assistants or agents, and then ask for like help in figuring out problems has already been shown to be a game changer. Something that the public is taking advantage of to find ways to solve problems that their doctors and nurses have just not been able to figure out because there's only so many hours in the day for those humans to do it. So the question is, when that butts up against law, what happens, right? Because there are regulations that make it so that a doctor is a person with a degree on the wall, and they're supposed to be the one that prescribes a certain type of drug or a treatment, But if an average human can find out with the help of an algorithmic assistant how to do the same thing and do it cheaper, I think a lot of people are going to exercise that. Now we have to be mature about answering the concerns. We have to understand that there are serious risks with that. The whole world of biohacking is something I'm extraordinarily excited about, but also very concerned about in other ways. When we decentralize medical information and medical therapies, that is still going to always be exciting to me. But at the margins, we know there's risks. And I think the real question for the future is how do we educate the populace to understand those risks and make sure that they are fully invested in like what their decision is and that we have clear consent. If they're working to utilize technologies to advance, medicine and like personal care, I applaud that. But we want to make sure they're doing it of their free will. No one's coercing them and that they understand the trade-offs if things go wrong. And so for me, the answer to all of these questions about what do we do about these FDA regulations? What do we do about these state laws? The answer is better consent. We just make it so that people are fully informed and they've made their decision, and we then give them the freedom to do that. So long as it doesn't bring harm to others when they do it, they should feel free to pursue those sorts of things. For some, that's radical. For me, that's just part of love and freedom, brother. That's like you got to defend the idea of people have the ability to, treat themselves and to like pursue their own types of approaches and not be paternalistic about telling them no at every juncture, like the FDA and other, state licensed bodies do. That needs to change. And now technology is going to force it, I think. That's my hope, at least.
Yeah. So we're concluding this podcast on a very optimistic note, right? So I think there's always like, especially with the technology we have today, I'm so much more optimistic, especially on the United States than I was 2 years ago. Just also learning how the federalist system works and how to navigate it, and with all these changes now. Also, crypto is also a very big sign of hope now with new legislation, and also just gaining more adoption. Stable coins are bigger than Visa and MasterCard now. So there's really no excuse for entrepreneurs not to do great things right now, utilize the present moment that we have. So thank you, Adam Thierer, for navigating us on the journey. Is there anything else you would like to give our listeners on the way, how to find you or engage with your work, or anything you want to draw attention to that's coming up?
Sure. Well, the books that I mentioned in the papers are all available online. If you just search for my name and permissionless innovation or technological freedom, you'll find all these things. I'm also on Twitter if people want to follow. My day-to-day thinking about things. I'm very much focused on AI policy right now because, of course, it's so hot. I don't spend as much time on crypto, unfortunately, but we've had some important wins there. But stay tuned because, as you said, Niklas, this is an exciting time to be alive. I happen to be, very pessimistic about politics, but very optimistic about technology and like what the American people and other people of the world can do when they're given these technologies of freedom to go out and explore and live a life of their own choosing.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Adam, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me again. Good seeing you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us 5 stars in your favorite podcast app and consider subscribing to our Substack. I appreciate your support that makes this show possible. See you in the next one.